we will do what the consumer thing happens, but when the going gets tough, the cash of a business is the oxygen. You could be the most ideological, epic, awesome person. And by the way, you know this is the biggest insight. The humans are saying this, but what happens when the humans themselves act differently when the going gets tough? Vayner Nation, how are you? Another exciting episode of the GaryVee Audio Experience with a man that some of you already know and many will discover. And I think this conversation is going to go quite well. We just laughed. We had 1 second before we went on. I said, Alan, anything you want to talk about? He goes, whatever you want to talk about. I'm like, good. This is going to be a great, we're going to be able to do a lot. Alan Murray, why don't you, I always like to let the guests take the first minute or two to create the context with the audience. I always want to make sure that they can position the context the way they want. So why don't you fire away and tell the Vayner Nation a little bit about who you are and yourself and your career, and then we'll go into it.
Well, I'm a lifelong journalist and also to some degree a lifelong entrepreneur. I started my first newspaper when I was 9 years old. I stayed in, edited my high school newspaper, college newspaper, worked many years at the Wall Street Journal, ran the Washington Bureau, did a few years doing a show at CNBC, then came to Fortune, and I'm now the CEO of Fortune. So it's a fairly consistent storyline. It's not too it's not too confusing. I suspect the reason I'm here, Gary, you'd have to tell me that, but I suspect the reason I'm here is because of a book I've written recently called Tomorrow's Capitalist. That was my attempt to try and get my head around what was going on, why I was hearing more and more business leaders talk more directly and intentionally about their impact on society. Something very different was going on in the conversations I was having with CEOs, and the book was my attempt to understand it and explain it.
So let's just go there. Obviously, when you think about the Wall Street Journal, when did you start at the Journal? Let's start. This actually good.
I started the Journal in 1983.
Perfect. That's exactly what I was hoping for, so everybody can understand where I'm going with this. In 1983, at the Wall Street Journal, how many CEOs running those Fortune 500 companies even nuanced the concept of something that their Coca-Cola or IBM or Chevy had impact on the world?
Yeah. Relatively few. I mean, there were sort of some cases out there that you could point to. I think of, the history of a company like Cummins Engine that was so inherently a part of its community. Yeah. But it was, look, we were in the thralls of Milton Friedman, the great economist, who said the social responsibility of business is to make a profit. And I think that was in the 1980s very much the reigning frame of mind.
Do you think that there's a danger that if it goes so the opposite way of that POV, that these things don't become sustainable? And I'll tell you where I'm going with that question, Alan.
Yeah, go.
My great obsession right now in America, and I think about it globally, but obviously America is who it is in the scheme of capitalism and societal ambition, that as America goes more red, more blue, we're pulling, that the answer is purple. It's the blend of the two. And that, I, for example, have incredible ambition and hopes, and I love being an entrepreneur, but I genuinely do like civility and kindness. And I think it's very easy to build a business that is profitable and can be nice and a positive impact. But I also believe that there's not a business on earth, nor is there a human on earth, that doesn't have shortcomings in some social framework.
Absolutely. No question.
And that if we ask businesses to be great at everything, that we could go too far and kind of lose our collective way.
But it's a fair concern, and we should talk about it. And I appreciate the fact you put it in a political context. But let me just take it out of the political context for a second. Let me give you another context for what I think is going on. There was some research done a few years ago about how do businesses create value, and they looked at the Fortune 500 in the 1970s. and they looked at the balance sheets and said, where's the value coming from at these corporations? And what you saw in the 1970s was more than 80% of the value came from physical stuff. It was plant, it was equipment, it was oil in the ground, it was inventory on the shelves. It was physical things that you needed financial capital to buy and build.
Yes.
If you do the exact same exercise today, what you'll find is more than 85% of the value of Fortune 500 companies is coming from intangibles. It's coming from intellectual property. It's coming from the brand value with the consumer. All of which are things that aren't tied to so much to physical stuff or financial capital. They're tied to people. They're tied to human beings. They're tied to your employees that walk in and out the door, and your customers who have a sense of brand loyalty for you. I mean, this is your business, Gary. You understand this. So I think what's really going on here is not a politicization of business. It's a humanization, if that's a word. Of business that I have a colleague, Jeff Colvin, who wrote a great book called Humans Are Underrated. And one of the things he said in the book is, we spent the 20th century trying to make people into better machines. They were cogs in the great factory, and they were supposed to do their role to make the machine work better. In the 21st century, the machines are taking care of themselves. Thank you very much. We need people to be better people. And so all of these things that I'm writing about and talking about, and the increased focus on contribution to society, is much more about that than it is about politics per se.
Talk to me about things that are in the water that challenge us humans to be better. For instance, something I'm obsessed with. I'm so pumped I get to ask you this.
Yeah.
The notion that nice guys finish last. In the context of the combo you and I are having right now, I'm fascinated by that because I have a lot of empathy for the women and men in business that I interact with all the time that don't even realize that that's the thing that they believe that's leading to their concern of overleading with their emotional intelligence or their heart. And thoughts on that? If I throw that out.
Oh my God. Well, look, I think in some ways that's the one of the biggest changes. You just look, we've already established that I've been doing this stuff for 4 decades, right?
Yes, sir.
So I've seen quite a lot of this.
Yes.
But you just used a word, empathy, that I can tell you for 3.5 decades of covering business, I never heard a business leader use. Just did not happen. And I just got off a phone call with a dozen CEOs who were talking about wellness in the workplace. And I heard the word 15 times in the course of 1 hour. I don't think that's just a semantic change. I think that's a dramatic change in the way that business leaders think about their jobs.
Do you believe the operators that believe in merit, competition, tenacity, all things I believe in, by the way?
Yeah, of course.
Get over concerned when they hear empathy and these things that they struggle with balancing the two because they don't realize it's an and versus an or. Is that your take?
I got to tell you, and maybe it's the CEOs I hang out with. I've spent a lot of time on this topic over the last 5 years, and so maybe the people I'm hearing from are a self-selected group, but I don't hear that anymore. I think that would probably have been true if you were talking to Jack Welch, and remember, Jack, that was only 20 years ago. That was only 20 years ago. But man, I don't hear it. One of the most amazing corporate statements that happened during the pandemic came from the CEO of Marriott, Arne Sorensen, who, when it became clear that his business was going to drop by 95% or more, I mean, think about that. It's just people weren't in the hotels, and so the company didn't have the financial wherewithal to keep everybody employed. And he made a Twitter message. You can search this on Twitter to send to his employees to explain why he was furloughing so many of them. It just so happened that at the same time he was making that message, he personally was suffering from very severe cancer, which subsequently killed him. And he, was showing the effects of the cancer treatment. But my God, it's a 2-minute video. I was in tears by the time the thing was over. I mean, this is a CEO telling his workforce that their jobs have disappeared. But the way he did it, the empathy, you know, the way he explained it to them, it was sort of a masterpiece of transparency and vulnerability and empathy and all the things that the Jack Welches of the world 20 years ago would never dreamed of doing. So it was, you know, a dramatic illustration of how times have changed.
What do you think are the massive, from your perspective, spending so much time, what do you think are the massive benefits? And what do you think are the changes that will become new challenges? Because you know, when you have these kind of seismic shifts, you know, this is all wonderful. I mean, you're talking to somebody who started a wine brand called Empathy long, you know, like I've been on this train for a long time because I'm very much my mother's son, and she was built on incredible emotional intelligence and compassion. And I'm very proud of how I've operated. On the flip side, recessions that are aggressive and sustained, America losing its pedestal of being the economic dominant player. You know, do you believe that this is potentially a trend in the maturity of a superpower that, when challenged, may have a tough time finding its balance in some of this? Because as organizations find their way, I can tell you as one that is built, so my company's code word internally is the honey empire. Honey over vinegar, but we're building an empire. We have 1,000 plus 27 and under year olds.
So Gary,
the thing I'll finish this, and this I'm guiding your take. The thing I spend time on is, how do I make this the greatest from all those emotional frameworks? And how do I also not create entitlement that creates the vulnerability of the task at hand? And for me, I'm confident because I don't have a board. I'm not a publicly traded company, and I'm in my most joyous when the people around me are enjoying. But I have empathy for people that are gonna have to deal with a public board, a public company, competition. And so when the going gets tough, I'm worried that they may deviate from words like empathy to words like, we've got to compete.
Maybe, but here's what's so interesting about what's happening right. First of all, let me say, you don't ask simple questions.
That's a compliment, right?
That is a compliment. Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
So in fact, if you want to, you know, like go refill your Starbucks cup, it may take a while. So I'll try and keep my answer concise.
No, take your time, because I think the depth is interesting, and I think you have a great perspective. So I'm excited.
So you asked about the good part of this, and then you asked about the parts that I think may not be sustainable. And I'm gonna put it in a little bit less of a political context than you did, and sort of just focus on business per se.
Please.
The good part is, you know, things like climate and things like diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think 5 years ago, most business leaders thought, oh, those are important, but they're kind of nice to do's. You know, they're like corporate social responsibility. I should do it because I'm a good person.
Yes.
Well, what's happened in the last 2 years that's so fascinating is it has become a business imperative. You know, start with climate. I had this fascinating conversation with Soren Skoo, who is the CEO of Moller Maersk, that runs the big shipping ships all over the world. And he has made this massive investment in hydrogen power using wind power in the North Sea. It is not economic. There is no current economic rationale for making the investment he made. And so I said, why'd you do it? Why are you spending all this money on something that is just, there's no way that's going to get close to the price of fossil fuel? And he said, I did it because every day I get a call from a customer who says, I just made this net zero climate commitment that requires me to get the carbon emissions out of my supply chain, and you're my supply chain. If you don't figure out how to operate your ships without carbon emissions, I can't meet my goal. And so there's this kind of reinforcing thing going on that has made it no longer just a good thing, but a business imperative. Think about GM. I mean, Mary Barra, the CEO of GM, made this extraordinary commitment in January of last year. She's only going to make electric cars by 2035.
Yep.
And that's not just pie in the sky commitment. I mean, she has to start investing against that commitment. She had to start the day she made the commitment. So did she do it because she thought it was the right thing to do for the environment? Yes. But did she also do it because she was afraid Tesla was going to take her business away from her? Yes. So it's become a business imperative.
Couldn't agree more.
And just one other thing before I finish it, because you talked about diversity and equity and inclusion. Same thing. We are in a massive battle for talent that most CEOs I talk to don't think is going to go away, even with a recession. And so if you're not figuring out how you create new pipelines for people who've been overlooked to bring them into the workforce, you're probably not going to win the talent war.
Alan, are you telling me that in the last 100 days, the CEOs that you're talking to do not feel that there's going to be a correction in the job market if the recession keeps going in the direction that it's going?
We just did a survey, just fresh out of the field, that shows that more than 2/3 of CEOs think there's going to be a recession. But then you ask them, what is the single biggest challenge you face? And you know what it is? It's not the recession. It's talent. So yes, I mean, will there be a correction? Maybe, but we've never had a moment where we are talking about recession and we're looking at 3.5% unemployment at the same time. It's never happened before.
It's going to be interesting because what's the dynamic that people don't see is that the internet has created so many options for people to make 6 figures a year with their side hustles, that the fragmentation of the long tail of the economics is very real. The question will become things like, hey, Gary, I don't need to get a job because I'm selling things on Amazon and making $150K a year. But if Amazon has to raise their fees because of a recession, does that become viable? Like, where the trickle-down economics, all these influencers, you can imagine my world. Gary, I make $200,000 a year in brand deals. I don't need to get a job. Yeah. Well, if the marketing budgets go into a different, so it's going to be, there's so many macro trends that are happening that may be affected in the micro with a recession. That will be an interesting game to see play out. And
what's happening on the other side of that equation, again, this is the dozen CEOs I was just on the line with. This is what they were talking about. What's happening on the other side of that equation is companies are just getting better at figuring out what they have to do to attract, retain, engage, excite people to come and work for them. It's just becoming, they're focusing intentionally on, how do I make this a better experience? Because if I don't make it a better experience, I'm not going to get the people I need.
I have such double feelings right now. I am so excited that a observer of your pedigree and social commentator to the sector I've loved. I followed business like it was sports my whole life. I'm pinching myself that this is the conversation we're having. If you told 1998 Gary, who came into his dad's liquor store with objective number one is to be more kind to our employees that stocked our shelves, that this would be a 2022 conversation, I would pinch myself out of happiness. On the flip side, as 2022 Gary, who's watched 2020 to 2022 and interacts daily with Fortune 500 CEOs and CMOs, the disconnect between the ambition of the ivory tower and the execution in the trenches is such a grand gap right now that I'm curious about the speed in which these conversations you're having become actually executable.
Yeah, and I thank you for taking me back, because I never answered your question of what are the limits of this. This doesn't mean, this is not greed is dead. This is not corruption is over. This is not. I mean, look, I spent a couple of years as the chief content officer for Time Inc. when there was still a Time Inc. before it went under.
Yes.
And I was in the C-suite of that company when it was under attack from shareholder activists who wanted it to produce more money each quarter.
Yep.
And what you see when you're in that position is there are hundreds of bad things you can do. When I say bad, it's bad for your employees, it's bad for your customers, it's bad for the environment maybe, bad for the long-term health of the company. But there are hundreds of bad things you can do that will make you money in that quarter.
Yes, sir.
And when you got a shareholder activist breathing down your throat, I see now Mark Benioff has one, right? Yeah, say we want more money next quarter.
You got to hold them off.
Stop all this fluffy talk. So no question, there are a bunch of short-term money-based pressures that can push companies to do bad things, and companies will continue to succumb to those pressures. But what I'm saying is, as somebody who has watched this for 4 decades, there is a set of countervailing pressures in place that are causing more and more corporate leaders to take a much more serious look at their social impact and at the long-term impact of their companies. And I don't think that's a silver bullet or solves all our problems, but I think it's a good thing.
I do too. I think it's a great thing because and again, I'm actually not using politics. I just think it's so easy for people to grasp given the macro. Let's use a seesaw. You don't have to use red and blue. Let's use a seesaw. To your point, if the seesaw is balanced left to right, and this is not about what you're saying, which excites the shit out of me personally, this is not seesaw going right to left. This is the seesaw is going flat.
Yeah, and the reason I reject, I mean, look, I worked many, many years at the Wall Street Journal. I know the folks on the editorial page very well. They've been leading the attack against woke CEOs and, saying that this is all a bunch of misguided business leaders trying to play footsie with Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren or something like that. The reason I think that's so misguided, well, let me use an example to make the case. 2 weeks ago, I was down in Bentonville, Arkansas with Doug McMillon. Doug McMillon is CEO of Walmart, has to be about as red of a CEO and as red of a company that you can imagine. I mean, he grew up in Arkansas. His first job was loading trucks at Walmart. The company serves red America, right? That's who their employees are. That's who their customers are. But he has said, we want this company to become the first truly regenerative company. Sounds like something Mark Benioff would say. And he has challenged his suppliers to get a gigaton of carbon emissions out of the environment. And you know how Walmart influences suppliers. And he has said, and he's changed the way, Sam Walton, great businessman that he was, I'm pretty sure thought of employees as an input, and his job was to get the price of that input as low as he could. So pay the absolute lowest wages. Doug McMillon has completely changed the way wages are set. We like to pay better wages.
I tell my friends all the time that take it to the extremes. I'm with you. To me, this is not about that. To me, this is about common sense. To me, this is not about politics. This is consumer centricality. What you're referring to is, if the humans are 85% of the thing, and this is what humans feel, we're going to do what the humans feel because that's the customer. 100%. I'm fully on board. I think what's going to be most interesting to me, because I'm fully on board, and so I wanted you here, and I like this middle, the seesaw we'll use instead of the red-blue, is that we will do what the consumer thing happens, but when the going gets tough, the cash of a business is the oxygen. You could be the most ideological, epic, awesome person. And by the way, this is the biggest insight. The humans are saying this, but what happens when the humans themselves act differently when the going gets tough? That's where I get it. Listen, I'm a very emotionally charged human. I kind of by default care about what everybody cares about. Like it's just kind of like my way.
Look, I totally thought when the pandemic hit and it became clear that the economy was going to go down into a recession, and that was about a year after the Business Roundtable had issued its kind of stakeholder governance statement. I totally thought, based on past experience, all of this stakeholder capitalism stuff was going to go away. That all these social concerns would be.
Well, guess what? It would have if we didn't print money.
Well, maybe, but it didn't go away. It increased. It went up
because we haven't felt it yet. That becomes the fun debate, right? Like, you know this, like if we don't print that money, everything's different. You have an entire generation of under 30, this is important. I think you'll like this, Alan. Because I'm in love with my employees and I talk to them all the time. And I have all these 27, 29-year-old employees like, Gary, really believe in what you're saying, try to be thoughtful with my money. They're like, COVID, I'm so glad I got to go through COVID. It was tough. I'm like, you got checks in the mail. What do you mean tough? This wasn't, and then I have all these 35-year-olds who went through 2008 and they're watching the 35-year-olds talk to the 25-year-olds in my office is my favorite because the 25-year-old thinks COVID was what 2008 was, and it surely wasn't. You had people sitting at home getting paid more to be at home than work.
That's a fair point. And when the money goes away, you can't spend the money. No question about that.
That's what my whole point is. I'll tell you where my energy is coming from if anybody's confused listening. I'm so into what Alan is saying that I'm hoping and praying because I do sense that it might get a little tough here for a little bit for real. Yep. And I'm hoping we don't lose our way.
Yeah, I hope you're right. Here's what I'm hearing from the best companies. What I hear from the best companies is, I was one business leader the other day quoted the Formula One race car driver who said, I can't pass 15 cars in the sun, but I can pass 15 cars when it's raining. And what I'm hearing business leaders saying is recession is when you really have to prove your stuff. If we believe our differentiator in the future is going to be commitment to the environment and commitment to people, then we have to hold on and stick to it and maybe even double down on it in the tough times in order to win the future. Because if we don't do that, somebody else will, and they'll get ahead of us. So there's a sense that this has become part of the competitive dynamic of business.
Not only is there a sense, you're actively talking to somebody who for the last 120 days has told his 50 direct reports that the next 2 years are going to be the biggest growth maybe in my career because we've committed to people for a decade and it's going to matter now.
There you go. There you go. And I salute you for it. I salute you for it, Gary.
And by the way, I tell people all the time, it's not because I'm Mother Teresa or altruistic. It's the purple. It's the flat seesaw. It's both now matter. It's an and game. It's not or. Our friends to the left or right or purple or blue, like where they get concerned is they live in a world of or. They think it's all going to go to this. It's not. It's about the middle.
And Gary, if I can just say one more thing, I mean, when I started my career, the business world defined the right. Now I'm going to politics. Yeah. The business world defined the right wing of the spectrum. But what's happened in our system, politics has gotten broken. Both the left and the right are no longer about solving problems. They're just about gaining political advantage in the next election. Business people have to solve problems. You can't be a successful business person if you don't solve problems. So by definition, you're purple. Because the red and the blue are not solving problems.
Brother, that couldn't be a better way to end this. I believe that there is a real chance for the business community to play that purple role in a meaningful, real way over the next 3 decades. And it's going to be fun to watch if that's true or not, or why or not. But I really appreciate discussion. I have a feeling a lot of people got a lot of value from it. I hope you enjoyed it, my friend.
Great fun. Thank you for having me.
And by the way, Vayner Nation, I know because all the authors email me 3-4 weeks later that this is a obnoxiously big book buying community. If you enjoyed this, Alan's absolutely right. It's funny, I don't consume information through long book form, but I write them and I advocate for them because 90% of you listening right now do. And I think Alan's got something for you. So one more time, Alan, so they can all go to Amazon or Barnes & Noble or local bookstore. What's the name of the book? One more time.
Tomorrow's Capitalist, my search for the soul of business, and all the profits go to Fortune. So if you can support good journalism in the process.
My friend, I wish you nothing but health and happiness.
Thank you, Gary.
Cheers.
Great to be with you.